The Great Hall of the Galactic Concord was shaped like the inside of a jewel. Walls of living crystal rose hundreds of feet into the air, glowing with soft blue and violet light that shifted like breath. Thousands of seats curved around a central platform, and in those seats sat the representatives of 43 alien civilizations. Some were tall and shining, some were small and covered in hard shells, some floated in sealed tanks of dark water. All of them were here for one reason. They were here to decide what to do about humanity. Nathan Cole stood alone on the central platform. He was 52 years old, average height, with gray at his temples and deep lines around his eyes that came from years of smiling at people who did not like him. He wore a simple dark suit. No medals, no symbols. He had learned long ago that in a room full of aliens who already thought humans were too loud and too proud, it was best to look like nothing at all. Behind him, and slightly to his left, stood Lucy Beckett. She was younger, mid-30s, with short brown hair and a face that gave away nothing. She had spent 10 years in naval intelligence before moving to the diplomatic corps, and she carried herself like someone who was always listening to a conversation happening in another room. Her fingers moved quietly across a datapad, recording every word spoken in the chamber. The first to speak against humanity was the Velhari ambassador. The Velhari were beautiful in the way a frozen lake is beautiful. Tall, thin, with skin that glowed faintly from within. They valued calm above all things. Emotion to them was a kind of pollution. The ambassador rose from his seat and spoke in a voice like wind through glass. He said that humans were a disruption. That, in the 90 years since their admission to the Concord, they had spread into every corner of shared space, like a weed that could not be pulled. He said their emotions were too strong, their ambitions too large, and their influence too deep. Wherever humans went, he said, things changed, and the Velhari did not want things to change. Nathan listened. He did not move. Next came the Krith Tal, an insectoid species with gleaming black eyes and clicking mandibles. Their representative spoke through a translator device that turned their rapid clicks into flat mechanical words. The Krith Tal were traders. They had controlled commerce across the Orion Arm for centuries, and they did not appreciate how quickly human merchants had carved out new routes, new markets, and new partnerships. Humans, the Krith Tal said, did not respect the old ways of doing business. They invented new ways, and that was dangerous. Lucy's fingers kept working on the datapad. Then came the Drenoi. They were aquatic beings, soft-bodied and pale, who spoke from within sealed water tanks, carried by mechanical legs. The Drenoi were worried about something different. They said that human culture was spreading among their young. Human music, human stories, human ideas about freedom and choice and individuality. These ideas, the Drenoi said, were poisoning the minds of their children. They wanted it to stop. One by one, other species rose to add their voices. Some were angry. Some were afraid. Some simply did not care about humanity one way or another, but had been promised favors in exchange for their vote. Nathan had seen this kind of politics before. It was ugly, but it was not complicated. The outcome had been decided long before anyone walked into this room. The vote was called. 38 in favor of Exile, 5 against. Humanity was to be removed from all Concord space. Every trade route cut, every embassy closed, every colony beyond the Sol exclusion zone emptied within one standard year. Humans would be pushed back behind their own borders and left there, alone, in the dark. The chamber fell silent after the count was read. Every eye and sensor and receptor turned toward Nathan Cole. They expected anger. They expected shouting, threats, maybe even tears. The Velhari ambassador leaned forward slightly, ready to savor the moment. The Krith Tal clicked softly among themselves. Even the Drenoi shifted in their tanks. Nathan looked down at his shoes for a moment. Then he looked at Lucy. She met his eyes and gave him a small nod. It was the kind of nod that carried the weight of years, of planning, of quiet conversations in sealed rooms, of preparations made in the dark where no one could see. Nathan turned back to the assembly. He smiled. It was not a bitter smile or a sad smile. It was warm and genuine. The kind of smile you give to someone who has just done you a favor they do not understand yet. "We accept," he said. "Effective immediately." Then he turned and walked out of the chamber. Lucy followed. Neither of them looked back. The silence behind them lasted a long time. The Velhari ambassador blinked. The Krithtal stopped clicking. Even the translator devices seemed unsure of what had just happened. Somewhere in the upper seats, a small reptilian delegate turned to his neighbor and whispered that he had expected the humans to fight. His neighbor said nothing. She was still staring at the empty platform. Nathan and Lucy walked through the long corridors of the Concorde station without speaking. Their footsteps echoed on floors made of polished alien stone. Aides from other species watched them pass with wide eyes. Word was already spreading. The humans had accepted. Just like that. No appeals, no protests, nothing. They boarded a shuttle and flew in silence across the short distance to the human flagship, the deep space carrier Steadfast. It was a big ship, not the biggest in the fleet, but solid and well built in a way that said more about the people who made it than any decoration could. Nathan walked straight to the command deck. Officers stood as he entered. He waved them down. He sat in a chair, loosened his tie, and opened a priority channel to Earth. The connection took 4 seconds. On the other end were the Joint Chiefs of the human military, the Secretary of Defense, and President Grace Dunbar herself. Her face filled the screen, strong jaw, dark eyes, silver hair pulled back tight. "How did it go?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She already knew the answer. Nathan leaned back. 38-5. They want us gone. Grace nodded slowly. There was no surprise on her face, no shock, just the quiet look of someone who had been holding a card for a very long time and had finally been given a reason to play it. "And your response?" she asked, though she knew that too. "I told them we accept." Grace allowed herself the smallest smile. It looked a lot like Nathan's. "Good," she said. "Activate Operation Closed Garden. All phases. No delays." Nathan closed the channel. He looked at Lucy, who was already pulling up logistics files on her datapad. She had been ready for this. They had all been ready for this. For 30 years, buried deep inside the most classified programs humanity had ever run, a plan had been waiting. A plan built on one simple idea that no alien species had ever thought to consider. What if humanity wanted to be alone? What if exile was not a punishment, but a key to a door that humanity had been building behind its back for decades, waiting for someone else to give them a reason to close it? Nathan looked out the viewport at the stars. The Concorde thought they had thrown humanity into the dark. They had no idea that the dark was exactly where humanity had always done its best work. He loosened his tie a little more, leaned back and closed his eyes. The door was closing, and behind it, something extraordinary was about to begin. The order came down at midnight, Earth Standard Time, and by morning the machine was already moving. Across 200 star systems, human embassies went dark. Lights shut off. Flags came down. Doors sealed with a hiss and a click that sounded final, because it was. Diplomatic staff moved to shuttles with packed bags and calm faces. No tears, no long goodbyes, just quiet, organized movement, like a tide pulling back from a shore. The aliens watched. They had expected chaos. They had expected humans to drag their feet, to argue, to beg for extensions. Instead, humanity moved like it had rehearsed this 1,000 times, and the truth was, it had. On the fringe colony of New Avalon, Commander Danny Hartwell stood on the roof of the settlement's main building and watched the last transport ship descend through pink clouds. New Avalon was a pretty world. Green hills, warm rain, air that smelled like fresh bread for reasons nobody had ever figured out. Humans had lived here for 40 years. They had built homes, schools, farms, and a medical center that served not just their own people, but also the Velhari settlements scattered across the neighboring valleys. Danny was 46. He had a square jaw, thick arms, and the kind of steady eyes that made people feel safe in a crisis. He had spent 20 years in logistics, moving people and supplies across the stars, and he had never failed to deliver. Today was no different. Every human on New Avalon would be off-world within 72 hours. Every piece of human technology would go with them. Every piece. His second-in-command, a young officer named Katie Marsh, came up behind him with a clipboard. She was efficient, sharp, and had a habit of chewing her lip when she was thinking hard. The Velhari governor sent another message, she said. He's asking about the water purification systems. Danny nodded. 15 years ago, humanity had built a network of advanced water purifiers for the Velhari towns in the valley below. It was a gift, a gesture of good neighbors. The Velhari had accepted it without much thanks, the way they accepted most human things, with polite distance and a vague sense that it was beneath them. Now those purifiers cleaned the water for 30,000 Velhari citizens. Pull them, Danny said. Katie looked at him. All of them? All of them. Every filter, every pipe, every solar panel attached to them. Pack it up and put it on the transports. The governor is going to be upset. Danny looked at her. There was no cruelty in his face, but there was no softness either. The Concord voted to exile us. They said our influence was dangerous. Our technology, our culture, our way of life, all of it. If we leave that equipment behind, we're contaminating their space. Their words, not mine. Katie nodded slowly. It was not revenge. It was a mirror. Humanity was simply giving the Concord exactly what it had asked for. The Velhari governor came in person the next day. He was tall and glowing, as all Velhari were, but his light flickered in a way that Danny had learned meant distress. He stood at the edge of the landing pad and watched human engineers disassemble the purification network with the same calm efficiency they did everything else. This is not necessary, the governor said. His voice was smooth but strained. Danny stood beside him with his hands in his pockets. With respect, Governor, your people voted to remove all human presence from Concord space. This is human technology, built by human hands, running on human designs. If we leave it, we're not respecting the terms of the exile. The governor opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no argument. The logic was perfect. That was the worst part. Across the galaxy, the same scene played out in 100 different ways. Human-built bridges on alien worlds were taken apart. Human medical databases were wiped from shared servers. Human agricultural techniques, shared freely for decades, were formally withdrawn. Everywhere the message was the same. You wanted us gone, so we are gone. All of us, every trace. And while Danny Hartwell and officers like him handled the withdrawal on the ground, Captain Nora Page handled it in space. Nora was 31, young for a ship captain, but she had earned her rank the hard way. She was tall and lean, with dark hair cut short, and brown eyes that missed nothing. She commanded a flotilla of 12 fast cruisers, and her orders were simple: seal the border. She did more than seal it. Working from blueprints that had been classified for over 20 years, Nora's engineers deployed a network of deep space sentinel stations along the entire perimeter of the Sol exclusion zone. These were not ordinary defense platforms. They were something else entirely. Each sentinel ran on a dark energy siphon, a technology the Concord did not know existed. Each one carried quantum-locked targeting arrays that could track and disable a ship from half a light year away, and each one broadcast a communication jamming field so advanced that it folded incoming signals into dimensional noise, making them not just unreadable, but invisible. Nora stood on the bridge of her flagship and watched the last sentinel come online. A soft chime filled the bridge. Green lights spread across the tactical display, like stars waking up. "Border is sealed," her tactical officer reported. "Full coverage. Nothing gets in or out without our permission." Nora nodded. She felt something she had not expected to feel. Not pride exactly, but something deeper. A sense of closing, of finishing something that had been waiting to be finished for a long time. She thought about the Concord delegates in their Crystal Hall, congratulating themselves on their vote. She wondered how long it would take them to realize that humanity had not just left, humanity had locked the door. And the lock was built from technology they could not even see, let alone break. Back on Earth, President Grace Dunbar stood in the broadcast room beneath the White House. The walls were lined with screens, showing feeds from every human colony, every military outpost, every civilian station, now pulling back behind the border. She watched it all with the focus of a surgeon watching a complex operation. When the last feed confirmed that the last human ship had crossed the border, she turned to face the camera. This broadcast would go to every human being alive. It would not be shared with the Concorde. It would not be translated into any alien language. This was a family conversation. Today, the Galactic Concorde voted to exile humanity from the stars. They believe they have punished us. They believe they have cut us off from the future. She paused. Her eyes were steady. They are wrong. Everything we ever shared with them, every piece of technology, every medical breakthrough, every engineering marvel, was 3 generations behind what we actually have. We gave them our past and kept our future. She let that sink in. For 30 years, in laboratories and shipyards that no alien eye has ever seen, we have been building. Not weapons of war, but tools of growth. Technologies that the Concorde's own laws would have forbidden us from developing. They put chains on our brightest minds and called it cooperation. Today, those chains are gone. She straightened her shoulders. The Concorde threw us out. Fine. We will build something so far beyond their imagination that when they finally look our way again, and they will, they won't even recognize what we've become. The broadcast ended. Across the solar system, and in every sealed colony behind the new border, humans watched the screens go dark, and then looked at each other. Nobody panicked. Nobody wept. 5 years passed. The galaxy waited for humanity to break. It never did. Behind the sealed border, hidden from every alien eye and every Concorde sensor, something remarkable was happening. Humanity was not just surviving, it was becoming something new. The first sign of this was Sam Ellison. Sam was 40 years old and looked like he had not slept in a decade. He was thin, pale, and had the kind of messy hair that suggested a man who forgot about mirrors the way most people forgot about yesterday's weather. He worked at a research station orbiting Neptune, a place so classified that it did not officially exist. Even its supply ships were automated, routed through dummy coordinates to keep the location secret. Sam was a physicist. More specifically, he was the kind of physicist who made other physicists nervous. He asked questions that most scientists had agreed were not worth asking. Not because the answers were impossible, but because the Concorde had made the research illegal decades ago. Faster-than-light travel existed in the galaxy. The Concorde used warp corridors, slow, expensive, carefully regulated lanes of bent space that connected major systems like highways connecting cities. Building a new corridor took years and cost more than most civilizations could afford. The Concorde controlled every corridor, and through that control, they controlled movement itself. It was power dressed up as infrastructure. Sam did not care about warp corridors. He cared about something else entirely. For 6 years, working with a team of 12 people who were just as obsessed as he was, Sam had been trying to fold space. Not bend it, not stretch it, fold it, like folding a piece of paper so that 2 distant points touched. Step through, and you were there. No corridor, no travel time. Just here, and then there. On a Tuesday morning that Sam would later barely remember, it worked. The machine, a tangle of cables, quantum processors, and magnetic rings that filled an entire cargo bay, hummed, then screamed, then went silent. A point of light appeared in the center of the rings. It was small, no bigger than a coin, and it shimmered like a drop of water hanging in empty air. On the other side of that point was a sensor drone, placed 3 light-years away, in orbit around a dead star. The drone's camera feed appeared on Sam's monitor. Clear, stable, real-time, no delay, no distortion. Sam stared at the screen. His hands were shaking. "That's 3 light-years," his assistant, a young engineer named Chris Holt, whispered. "Instant, no corridor." Sam sat down on the floor because his legs would not hold him anymore. He pressed his palms against his eyes and breathed. He had just made every warp corridor in the galaxy obsolete. He had just given humanity the ability to go anywhere, instantly, without asking anyone's permission. He called it threading. Within a year, the first threading gates were built. Within 2 years, human ships were jumping across distances that would have taken the Concorde's fastest vessels months to cross. And Sam's team was already looking further, not just across the Milky Way, but beyond it, to other galaxies, to places no living being in known history had ever reached. On Mars, another kind of revolution was happening. Dr. Wendy Garza worked in a facility carved into the red rock beneath Olympus Mons. She was 55, broad-shouldered, with steady hands and a laugh that could fill a room. Before the Exile, she had served on the Concorde's Medical Advisory Board, where she had spent years watching alien bureaucrats block human genetic research for reasons that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with fear. The Concorde species were old. Their bodies were set. They evolved slowly, changed slowly, and they liked it that way. The idea that humans could modify their own biology, could make themselves stronger, faster, more adaptable, terrified them. So they banned it. And Wendy had obeyed, because the Concorde's rules were the price of membership. Now, there were no rules. Wendy's program was called adaptation. The idea was simple, but its reach was enormous. Instead of spending centuries trying to change a planet to fit humans, Wendy's team changed humans to fit the planet. Heavier gravity? They strengthened bones and muscles at the genetic level. Thin atmosphere? They redesigned lung capacity and oxygen processing. They adjusted skin and immune responses to handle chemicals that would kill an unmodified person in hours. The first adapted colonists left for a world called Ember, a harsh planet with crushing gravity and sulfur-yellow skies that no Concorde species had ever been able to settle. The colonists walked out of their ships, took deep breaths of air that smelled like matches, and smiled. They were home. Humanity was spreading, not outward as it had before, begging for permission to settle on land the Concorde approved. It was spreading in every direction at once, threading through folded space to worlds and systems that no alien had ever mapped, adapting itself to fit wherever it landed. And in the quiet spaces between the science and the expansion, something else was growing. Artists painted on the hulls of colony ships. Writers published stories that were read by millions across human space. Musicians played in concert halls built on moons that had been lifeless rock 5 years earlier. Philosophers debated the meaning of isolation, of identity, of what it meant to be human when there were no aliens to compare yourself to. People called it the Quiet Renaissance. It was not loud or dramatic. It was deep, like roots growing in good soil. Humanity, cut off from the galaxy, was rediscovering itself. But outside the wall, the story was different. The Krith Tal were the first to feel the pain. Their economy had been built on trade, and human merchants had been their best customers and their fiercest competitors. Without them, markets shrank. Prices shifted in ways the Krith Tal could not control. Within 3 years of the Exile, 2 of their largest trading houses collapsed. Unemployment spread through their hive cities like a disease. The Drenoi had a different problem. For decades, they had quietly relied on human pharmaceutical research to treat a genetic condition that affected nearly a quarter of their population. They had never admitted this dependence publicly. It was embarrassing for a species that considered itself superior. But the drugs they needed came from human labs. When those labs went dark, the supply dried up. Within 4 years, a full-blown health crisis swept through Drenoi space. Hospitals overflowed. Their own scientists scrambled to reverse-engineer the human treatments, and failed. 3 smaller species on the galactic rim, civilizations that most Concord members had barely noticed, began to collapse entirely. These were worlds that had depended on human-built infrastructure for basic needs: water, power, food processing. When Danny Hartwell and officers like him pulled that infrastructure out, nothing replaced it. Crops failed. Power grids went dark. Populations that had been stable for centuries began to shrink. The Concord held emergency sessions. Committees were formed. Reports were written. Proposals were debated. Nothing was solved. The Concord was very good at talking. It had never been very good at doing. That had always been humanity's job, though nobody had wanted to say it out loud. 5 years after the Exile, the Velhari government made a cautious, careful attempt at contact. They sent a diplomatic probe to the human border, a small, unarmed vessel carrying a formal message requesting preliminary discussions regarding the possibility of limited re-engagement. The probe reached the border. It stopped. It waited. Nothing happened. They sent a second probe. Same message, slightly warmer tone. Nothing. This one carried a personal message from the Velhari foreign minister, expressing deep respect for the human people and a desire to explore mutual interests going forward. It was the closest thing to an apology the Velhari had ever produced. The probe was returned 2 days later. It was undamaged. Its message banks were untouched. The humans had not even opened them. Stamped on the hull in simple block letters, in every major galactic language, was a single sentence: "Per your vote, no further contact required." The Velhari foreign minister read the message, set down the report, and stared out his window at the stars for a very long time. Somewhere out there, behind a wall of silence and technology he could not penetrate, humanity was doing something, growing, changing, becoming. And they were not interested in talking about it. 10 years after the Exile, the Galactic Concord was falling apart. It happened slowly at first, like cracks spreading through old glass. Small disagreements that used to be settled in a single session now dragged on for months. Old grudges between species that had been buried for centuries clawed their way back to the surface. The crystal halls where diplomats once debated policy with cool detachment now echoed with raised voices and sharp accusations. The problem was simple, though none of them wanted to admit it. Humanity had been the glue. Not because humans were better or smarter or wiser than anyone else, but because humans were different from everyone else in one important way. They talked to everybody. They traded with the Krith Tal, and shared music with the Drenoi, and built infrastructure for species so small and forgotten that the rest of the Concord did not even remember their names. Humans were loud and messy and emotional, and they stuck their hands into everything, and somehow, without anyone noticing, they had become the thread that held 43 civilizations together. Now, the thread was gone. The Krith Tal and the Drenoi were the first to turn on each other. A disputed mining region on the edge of their shared territory, a region that human mediators had quietly managed for decades, became the center of a Cold War. Warships gathered on both sides. Threats were exchanged. The Concord tried to intervene, but without human diplomats doing the unglamorous work of sitting in a room with both sides until a deal was reached, the talks went nowhere. 2 smaller civilizations on the galactic rim, the ones that had already been struggling since the human withdrawal, went silent. Their communications stopped. Their trade ships stopped flying. When a Concord survey vessel finally visited, they found empty cities, abandoned farms, and populations that had scattered into the wilderness to survive however they could. Governments had simply stopped existing. High Arbiter Zelken stood at the window of his private chamber in the Concord capital and stared out at the galaxy. He was old now. The light beneath his skin, once strong and steady, had dimmed to a faint glow. He had been the one who pushed hardest for the Exile. He had stood before the assembly and argued, with perfect Velhari logic, that humanity was a threat to the stability of the Concord. Too fast, too ambitious, too different. He had been right about all of those things. He had just been wrong about what they meant. Reports came across his desk every day. Economic decline in Krithtal space, medical crisis in Drenoi territory, border disputes multiplying like sparks in dry grass, and beneath it all, a quieter, more troubling trend. Young Velhari were losing faith in the Concord. A whole generation had grown up with human music in their ears and human stories in their minds. Smuggled copies, passed around in secret, treasured like forbidden fruit. These young Velhari asked uncomfortable questions. Why did we send them away? What were we afraid of? What did we lose? Zelkin had no good answers. Behind the wall, humanity had changed in ways even Nathan Cole had not fully predicted. Admiral Pete Rawlings sat in his office at Outer Reach Command, a sprawling military complex built into the hollow core of a captured asteroid beyond the orbit of Pluto. He was 58, broad across the chest, with a shaved head and the careful eyes of a man who thought 3 moves ahead. He had spent his career in the human navy, rising through the ranks on competence and patience rather than ambition. His job now was to manage something that would have seemed like science fiction a decade ago. Thanks to Sam Ellison's threading technology, humanity had expanded not just across the Milky Way, but beyond it. Human outposts existed in 3 neighboring galaxies. Survey teams had mapped thousands of new star systems. Colony ships, carrying adapted humans designed by Wendy Garza's program, had settled worlds so far from Earth that light from the sun would take millions of years to reach them. Pete's fleet reflected this new reality. Thousands of ships, each one built with technology that made Concord vessels look like antiques. But these were not warships. Pete had insisted on that. They were explorer carriers. Massive, versatile vessels designed for long-range missions, first contact scenarios, and the establishment of new human settlements in uncharted space. "We don't go back," Pete told his officers at every briefing. "We don't answer their calls. We don't look over our shoulders. We build forward." He meant it, but he was also practical enough to keep the border defenses sharp. Trust was earned, and the Concord had not earned anything. Nora Page had earned plenty. She was Vice Admiral now, 41 years old, and she commanded the deep-range survey fleet, the ships that went furthest, stayed longest, and found the things nobody expected. She had threaded her fleet to the very edge of the observable universe, mapping systems so distant that their light had not yet reached the Milky Way. It was there, in the deep black, that she found the lattice. Her science officer, a quiet man named Greg Fenton, was the first to spot it. He was running a routine scan of a region that should have been empty when his instruments registered something massive. Not a star, not a planet, a structure. Then another, then dozens, then hundreds. They stretched across light years, connected by threads of energy so faint they were almost invisible. Each structure was different. Some were spheres the size of small moons. Some were long and angular, like frozen lightning. But they were all clearly built by someone, or something. "How old are these?" Nora asked, standing behind Greg and staring at the display. Greg ran the numbers twice before answering. "Conservative estimate? 2 billion years, maybe older." Nora felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. 2 billion years. Whatever had built these structures had been old when the first single-celled organisms were forming on Earth. The Concord species, for all their pride in their ancient civilizations, were children compared to this. "Are they active?" she asked. "Dormant," Greg said. "Low-level energy readings, like something in deep sleep. But not dead. No, ma'am, not dead." Nora ordered a full survey. Her team spent weeks documenting the lattice, collecting data, running analyses. The findings were extraordinary and frightening. The structures were not just old. They were a network, a galaxy-spanning web of technology, so advanced that human scientists could barely describe it, let alone understand it. And the faint energy readings were not random. They pulsed, slowly, like a heartbeat. Whatever the lattice was, it was waiting. Nora sent her report back to Earth on a classified channel. It reached Pete Rawlings first. He read it again, and then sat alone in his office for an hour, thinking. Then he forwarded it to President Dunbar with a single note. "We may need to prepare for something bigger than the Concorde." Dunbar read the report. She did not panic. She created a new classified program and assigned humanity's best minds to study the lattice, quietly, carefully, without telling anyone outside the wall. Meanwhile, the Concorde made a mistake. A faction of Krithtal military commanders, frustrated by the economic decline and emboldened by the belief that humanity had weakened behind its wall, assembled a fleet of 200 warships. Their plan was simple and stupid. Punch through the human border, seize a few colonies, and force humanity back to the negotiating table. They hit the Sentinel network at full speed. It lasted 11 minutes. The Sentinels did not even wake up a human operator. Automated systems identified the incoming fleet, calculated threat levels, and responded with surgical precision. Engines were disabled. Weapons were melted off their mounts. Shields were drained. In less than a quarter of an hour, 200 warships were reduced to 200 drifting hulks, powerless and dark. Not a single crew member was killed. Not one. The Sentinels cut the ships apart like a surgeon removing a splinter, carefully enough to leave the patient alive. Escape pods were deployed automatically. Each pod was stocked with food, water, medical supplies, and enough fuel to reach the nearest Concorde outpost. Attached to every pod was a small metal plate engraved with a message in 17 languages. "We could have. We chose not to. Don't test us again." The Krithtal commanders drifted home in their little pods, surrounded by the wreckage of their ambitions, and said nothing to anyone for a very long time. Back on the Concorde capital, Zelkin received the report. He read the part about 11 minutes 3 times. He set the report down and pressed his hands together in the Velhari gesture of deep thought. 11 minutes, 200 warships, no casualties. He understood then, with a clarity that hurt, that the Concorde had not exiled a minor species. They had locked the door on something they could no longer comprehend. And behind that door, in the silence and the dark, humanity had become something that even the Velhari, with their 12,000 years of civilization, could not match. Zelkin closed his eyes and whispered a word in his own language. It had no direct translation, but it meant something close to, "What have we done?" 20 years after the vote, the lattice woke up. It started with a whisper. Deep space sensors across Concorde territory picked up energy readings that made no sense. Faint vibrations in the fabric of space itself, like someone had struck a bell so large that the sound could only be felt, not heard. Scientists on a dozen worlds ran their instruments twice, 3 times, then contacted each other in quiet, frightened messages. Something was moving in the deep black. Nora Page, now Vice Admiral and commander of humanity's furthest fleet, was the first to see it clearly. She stood on the bridge of her flagship, the long-range explorer farthest shore, and watched her tactical display light up with contacts that should not have existed. The lattice structures, the ancient dormant network her team had discovered a decade ago, were no longer dormant. Energy was flowing through them, like blood through veins that had been dry for 2 billion years. And at the edges of the network, where the structures were thickest, something was emerging. Massive shapes, dark against the faint glow of distant galaxies, moving with slow and terrible purpose. "How big are they?" Nora asked. Her voice was calm. She had trained herself to be calm in moments like this, though her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. Greg Stenton, her science officer, looked up from his console. His face was gray. "The smallest ones are roughly the size of Earth's moon. The largest—" He trailed off and swallowed. "The largest are bigger than Jupiter." Nora let that settle. Moon-sized objects, planet-sized objects, moving through space under their own power, guided by a network that predated every known civilization by billions of years. "How long before they reach populated space?" she asked. "At current speed, 18 months for the outer Concord systems, maybe 2 years for the core worlds." She turned to her communications officer. "Open a priority channel to Outer Reach Command. Admiral Rawlings, now." Pete Rawlings received the message in his office. He read Nora's report, looked at the data, and made 3 decisions in rapid order. First, he activated every deep-range fleet humanity had. Second, he sent a classified briefing to Earth. Third, he poured himself a glass of water and drank it slowly, because he had learned long ago that the best thing a commander could do in a crisis was stay hydrated and stay steady. The briefing reached President Dunbar's successor, a man named Leo Grant, who had taken office 6 years earlier. Leo was younger than Grace had been, quieter, with the thoughtful manner of someone who listened more than he spoke. He read the briefing, called his advisors, and made the same calculation that every human leader had made since the Exile. What does this mean for our people, and what do we do about it? The answer was complicated. Humanity had spent 20 years building, growing, and reaching into parts of the universe no one else had touched. They had the technology to face what was coming. They had the ships, the science, and the people. What they did not have was any obligation to help the Concord. The Concord had thrown them out, told them they were dangerous, stripped them of their trade routes, their embassies, and their place in galactic society. Every logical argument said that humanity should stay behind its wall and let the Concord deal with its own problems. Leo Grant sat alone in his office for a long time, thinking about logic. Then he thought about something else. He thought about his grandmother, who had grown up in a small town where the neighbors never liked her family much. When a storm destroyed half the town, his grandmother was the first one out with supplies and tools, helping rebuild houses for the same people who had whispered about her behind her back. When Leo asked her why, she said something he never forgot. Because that's who we are. And no amount of ugly from other people changes that. Leo picked up the phone and called Pete Rawlings. "How fast can we be ready?" "We've been ready for 10 years, sir." "Good. Open the wall." The Concord did not know any of this yet. What they knew was that something was coming, and they were not prepared. Panic spread through the crystal halls. Emergency sessions ran day and night. The Krithtal mobilized their remaining fleet, which was large but outdated. The Draenei pulled their ships into defensive formations around their homeworld. Smaller species simply prayed, each in their own way, to whatever they believed in. High Arbiter Zelkin, now very old, his light so dim it barely showed through his skin, made a decision that cost him every shred of Velhari pride he had left. He boarded a diplomatic vessel and flew to the human border himself. He arrived at the wall, that invisible line of sentinel stations and jamming fields that no Concord ship had crossed in 20 years. He powered down his weapons, opened every channel his ship had, and transmitted a message in every human language his translators could handle. The message was short. It said that the Concord was facing a threat beyond its ability to survive. It said that the Velhari and all Concord species had been wrong to exile humanity. It said that he, Zelkin, was personally sorry, and it asked with no conditions and no demands for help. Then he waited. 1 day passed, nothing. 2 days. His crew grew restless. Some suggested turning back. Zelkin told them to be still. 3 days. The stars were quiet. The border was dark. Then on the morning of the 4th day, the wall opened. It did not open slowly. It did not crack or crumble. One moment it was there, a barrier of energy and silence, and the next it was gone, pulled aside like a curtain, and through the gap came a single ship. Zelkin had seen many ships in his long life. Velhari cruisers, elegant and bright, Krithtal haulers, massive and functional, Drenoi swimmers, curved and smooth. He had never seen anything like this. The ship was enormous. It moved through space the way a whale moves through deep water, with power so vast it did not need to hurry. Its hull was dark, layered and seamless, and it radiated energy signatures that Zelkin's instruments could not identify. Light bent around it in ways that suggested the ship was not entirely in normal space. A communication channel opened. A voice came through, clear and human and familiar. "Hi, Arbiter Zelkin. This is Ambassador Nathan Cole." Zelkin closed his eyes. He remembered that voice. He remembered a man standing on a platform in the Great Hall, smiling as though the worst day of his life was actually the best, and saying 2 words that had changed everything. "We accept." "Ambassador Cole," Zelkin said. His voice cracked slightly. "You came." "I did," Nathan said. "Permission to come aboard?" Nathan Cole boarded the Velhari ship with a small delegation. He was older now, in his 70s, with white hair and deep lines on his face, but his eyes were the same, sharp, warm, and carrying a knowledge that went deeper than words. Beside him walked Admiral Pete Rawlings, solid and calm as a mountain. Behind them came Vice Admiral Nora Page, who moved with the alert grace of someone who had spent years on the edge of known space, and had seen things that would keep lesser people awake at night. They stood in the Velhari ship's receiving hall, humans and aliens face to face for the first time in 20 years. Zelkin looked at Nathan and struggled to find words. His translators hummed, waiting. Nathan spoke first. "You told us to leave, and we did. We went further than you can imagine. We built things you have never dreamed of. We went to places your maps don't even show." He paused. "And now something is coming. Something old. Something that will eat every world in this galaxy if it isn't stopped." Zelkin's light flickered. "Can it be stopped?" Nathan looked at Pete. Pete gave a barely visible nod. "Yes," Nathan said. "It can. Because we spent 20 years getting ready for exactly this kind of moment. Not because we knew this was coming, but because we knew that one day something like this might. But because that's what humans do. We prepare, we build, we adapt, and we don't stop." He stepped closer to Zelkin. His voice softened. "You threw us out, and honestly, it was the best thing that ever happened to us. But we didn't come back to rub that in. We came back because there are billions of people on Concord worlds who had nothing to do with that vote. Children who have never met a human. Families who just want to live. We are not going to let them die because their leaders made a bad call 20 years ago." He straightened up. "We're not rejoining the Concord. Those days are over. But we will lead, and if your people can follow, we will get through this." Zelkin bowed. It was the deepest bow a Velhari could give, the kind reserved for moments of profound respect. "We will follow," he said. Nathan nodded. Then he turned to Nora. "Show them." A signal pulsed out through the border, through threading gates hidden across the galaxy and beyond, reaching every human fleet, every outpost, every ship waiting in the dark. They came. From every direction, through folds in space that the Concord could not see or understand, human ships appeared. Thousands of them. explorer carriers the size of cities, fast cruisers that flickered with energy fields that bent light, science vessels bristling with instruments designed to study and fight things that were older than stars. They threaded in from across the Milky Way and from other galaxies entirely, assembling in formations so precise they looked like living geometry. On the bridge of a Concorde observation vessel, a young Velhari officer stood at the viewport and watched the human armada take shape against the stars. She was barely 30, born after the Exile, raised on smuggled human songs and forbidden human stories. She had imagined this moment 100 times. The reality was bigger than anything she had dreamed. "What are they?" she whispered. Her captain, an old Velhari, who remembered the vote and had carried the weight of it ever since, stood beside her. He watched the ships, so many ships, arranging themselves between the Concorde and the coming darkness. He watched the lights on their hulls pulse in patterns that looked almost like a heartbeat. He watched and said nothing for a long time. Then he answered, "They're the ones we threw away, and they came back anyway." The young officer looked at him. There were tears on her face, something that would have horrified an older generation of Velhari. She did not try to hide them. Out in the black, the human fleet finished its formation. The ancient shapes in the deep continued their slow approach. And between them, standing in the gap, was humanity, exiled, underestimated, and unbroken. Nathan Cole stood on the bridge of his ship and looked out at the stars. Lucy Beckett, gray-haired now, but still carrying that same datapad, stood beside him. "Think they're ready?" Lucy asked. Nathan watched the fleet spread out before him, the largest gathering of human strength in history, assembled not for conquest, but for protection, not for revenge, but for rescue. "We've always been ready," he said. That's the part they never understood. The fleet moved forward, and the galaxy, for the first time in 20 years, had reason to hope.